One of my favorite Disney movies growing up was Pocahontas. I loved it. I sang it. It was one of the only Disney princesses or even characters that even looked a little bit like me and was actually representative of my identity, at least in part. As a Lumbee, a little Locklear girl, it was what I had, and I belonged to. I also had Esmeralda, but my love of, affinity for, and the human rights concerns regarding Romany people, or better known as the derogatory gypsies, is a different topic for a different homily. The story of Pocahontas was taught throughout school, and it was sometimes alluded to that it was a little bit different than the movie. It wasn't until college, when I was minoring in history in my Indigenous Studies class, that I learned in full detail the horror story of Pocahontas. Disney has come under many harsh criticisms for many of their cultural stories, whether it's adherence to a cultural tradition too tightly or parting too far away. But the stories were told nonetheless, which most stories go untold. Today, I will tell you some stories that you might not have known about some Indigenous groups and clarify the story of Pocahontas. Stories that have no major movies, sports teams, or holidays. So today, the day before Columbus Day, or as we now know it, Indigenous Peoples Day, I will tell you some stories that you may never hear unless you seek them out. So on the day we once claimed for discovery of a land that had long been found, I'll share with you the stories that have yet to be discovered by major media. The tribe I'm a part of has been known for many things. For the hotly debated lack of federal recognition, for tribal lands being one of the poorest counties in North Carolina, for the annual homecoming where tribal members return to their ancestral land, and for my personal favorite, grape ice cream and collard wraps. We are the people of the swamps, of the tea-stained waters, and an amalgamation of indigenous and colonizer culture, forced assimilation, and an ongoing battle not only against the U.S. government, but other tribes for federal recognition and funds. Those might be the things you'd hear in a history class or maybe a PBS special. But one story you may not have heard that stuck with me as a child and into adulthood was that of Henry Berry Lowry. Henry was named an outlaw. Of course he was. He was an Indian who lived in the Civil War and post-Civil War era. He led a gang of other outlaws, often described by those not in power as Indian Robin Hoods. He fought the institutions of the Confederacy, Confederate prison camps, and committed crimes including robbery and even murder against Confederate political leaders that fought to do the same to people and the land, but legally. Henry had his own war, amply named the Lowry War, where there was a bounty on Henry and those in his gang. Lowry was seen as a legend, tribal leader, and major disruptor in Confederate and institutional white supremacy plans, which ultimately in part still occurred, with some effects occurring today. When we as UUs engage with the second principle for justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, I can't help but think of Henry. While his methods of murder challenge my own morals for social change at best, it leaves us with the question of legality versus morality, a thinly veiled line which always benefits the dominating and exploitive group. The crimes of treason are often so subtly or acutely the acts of resistance of an oppressive regime. When we reflect upon our own lives, on our own social justice, on our own value and ethical systems, I pose the question on who is the authority? The authority of our own lives, our families, communities, religious groups, regions, and our nations. Like the voices that Henry heard and felt so loudly from the Confederacy that he fought persistently against, he was an outlaw. And I agree with that. But in the literal sense of the word, he was in fact an outlaw in that he was outside of the law. And sometimes, oftentimes, that's the best place for change to happen. When throughout history we have had oppressive ruling classes with religious systems that often reinforce those laws in a visage of piety, but often just truly control. Legality is not synonymous with morality. We must ask, how do we become and reclaim the title of outlaw? As UUs, we often do this. Though most of our social justice, at least what I know of, is well within the limits of the law, I can't help but question what would our impact be if it was outside the law? Calm down. This is not to incite lawlessness, but rather for our laws and regulations to come under questions of morals, ethics, and justice for all, and not the few. The few who may be the actual minorities, and not those, in fact, who have been minoritized. If you're not familiar with the term minoritized versus minority, it's a social science term that truly states minorities are anything but. The term minority literally represents those groups that make up less than 50% of a population. So let's talk numbers. In the US, according to the Census and Gallup polls, there are those who openly identify as LGBTQIA+ at 7%, women 50.4%, BIPOC people, which I'm including Black, Indigenous, Asian, Middle Eastern, Hispanic, and multiracial, so non-white, make up about 43.6%. Children and older adults, 39%. 8.7% of people have a known disability, with 9.3% being uninsured, and a whopping 11.5% of those people living at or below the poverty line. That adds up to 169%. That doesn't sound like a minority at all. Well, that's not technically how statistical analysis or percentages actually work, but it does illuminate my point. All of those numbers I gave are people often considered minorities for one reason or another, but because they make up less than that magical 50% number. But more often than not, these groups have actually been minoritized. In the sense, their cultural, emotional, financial, spiritual, physical, medical, and recreational needs have gone unmet or undermet by the majority or exploitive majoritized groups. The true minority, cisgender, heterosexual white men actually only account for about 31% of the total population. Yet 97% of all Republican elected officials are white and 76% are male. Of all Democratic elected officials, 79% are white and 65% male. That's a lot of numbers, and you're here for a homily. But why do the numbers matter? Because representation matters. Why does representation matter? Because it affects our customs, cultures, and yes, laws. So if all the lawmakers don't represent all the people they represent in a representative democracy, how much representation is there really? This takes me back to Pocahontas and the little media representation I had. Media representation impacts belonging, self-esteem, and identity. Growing up, I had an aptitude for intellectual pursuits, debate, a strong justice code, a love of human, animals, and the planet, and creating a better world for us all. However, most politicians, lawmakers, law enforcers, celebrities, and even peacemakers didn't really look like me. I recognized myself in totality in almost no one. In fact, the work I wanted to do in life was often done for people who look like me, not by people who look like me. But who did look like me? Pocahontas, and yes, Esmeralda too. Both portrayed as strong women, unreliant of men, the current political and social systems, both in their minoritized and exploitive majoritized cultures, alignment with the planet and animals, and my favorite, a strong sense of justice. There wasn't much representation, sense of belonging, or connection, but I had two, and two was enough. I believed there would be more, and there are, and that I'd be one of them, and I am. When I read several of the true accounts of Pocahontas, I was equal parts shocked, mortified, and heartbroken. But first, let's acknowledge her by her birth name, Amanute, and her used name, Matawaka. The story of Matawaka was far from what Disney said. She didn't care for John Smith. She met him later in life, and honestly, she truly feared him as he was known for his brutality within the indigenous communities, especially the sexual assault of children. She didn't despise Kocoum, and in fact, he was her father and husband of her child. After many plans to kidnap Matawaka, she was in fact kidnapped, forced to give up her child, Kocoum, like in the Disney movie, was killed by her captors. Machawaka, being a daughter of a chief, was seen by colonizers as a bargaining tool. But by one of her captors, Captain Samuel Argall, he equated and offered to trade her for a copper pot, a nod to how little her life truly meant to him. Like in the movie Pocahontas 2, she was kidnapped to England to show peace between those who disapproved of the treatment of indigenous people, because that makes sense. In her time in England, she was sexually assaulted, birthed a resulting child, forced to convert to Christianity, and take the anglicized Christian name Rebecca, as she often begged to return home. When she finally did meet John Smith, she outcried at the mistreatment of her and her people. Machawaka was finally set to return home to her little Kocoum who survived, and it was reported that she had health enough to make her voyage. But days before the voyage, at dinner with John Rolfe and Argall, she vomited and died. Despite pleading to return her body was not laid to rest with her people, and her father, grief-stricken, died less than a year later after her death. Machawaka did not make it to her 21st birthday. After reading several scholarly books on her story, my heart sank. I knew the trauma of indigenous people, of minoritized people, of my own papa who went to Indian normal school. But the romanticized version of Pocahontas that I'd come to know and love and be inspired from left much more than Disney magic to the imagination. Pocahontas was the original and possibly the most famous MMIWG, missing, murdered, and indigenous women and girls. Today, there are over 5,000 MMIWG cases reported, with only a small number logged into criminal databases and some total lack of records in many databases. Murder is the third leading cause among death of American Indian and Alaska Native women ages 10 to 24, with the reported youngest victims being babies under age of 1 and the oldest reported victim being an elder of 83 years of age. 83 years of personally witnessing the rise and fall of Indian normal schools, segregation and Jim Crow laws, which affected indigenous people as well, countless promises by the U.S. government broken, and ultimately her own life taken by the hands of murder. Within the indigenous world, much has been taken: land, families, and cultures. Last Sunday, after I left the Dance of the Harvest Moon Lumbee powwow, someone close to me said, "It's just time to move on. It all happened so long ago." My last story I'll tell is of someone local, right here in Leland, that has happened within the last year. They were set to attend today, but were unable to. The past is not so far away. It is still happening. Ashley Lomboy and her 6-year-old first-grade son Logan, members of the local Waccamaw Siouan tribe, were told by the classical charter school system that his hair violated the school's policy. In a letter, it was worded that long hairs on boys was faddish and violated the policy that boys' hair should not be distracting, extreme, radical, or faddish haircuts, hairstyles, and colors are not allowed. Logan keeps his hair long as a part of his cultural identity, and at school wore his hair in a bun to keep it off his shoulder and collar in adherence to the policy. Logan was told he must cut his hair. The ACLU has been involved, and in a March statement, Classical Charter Schools of America defended its long-standing grooming policies, claiming they are applied regardless of a student's race, religion, income, cultural background, or national origins. I will task you with keeping informed of the cultural oppressions that occur locally and throughout the nation. The traumas of our past live on today, but so do our traditions. Logan and many other indigenous people keep their hair long as a link to their cultural identity, self-esteem, belonging, power, and strength. Each custom and significance is often unique to each tribal nation, individual, often different cultures that after colonization was further referred to and mistermed as the American Indians. So for as many strands in a braid, there are reasons for the cultural significance, and I'll invite you to explore these many meaningful reasons. For me, the power of hair and the braid is a reminder of the many strands that make up the braid, which is always stronger, more durable, and resilient when braided together, and to be able to celebrate each strand. Kind of similar to humans. For the most beautiful braid allows each strand to be seen, understood, and celebrated, just like the most beautiful communities do as well. You might be asking me, Mercedes, this was heavy. Not really the inspiration I was looking for today. But to acknowledge trauma, pain, hurt, loss, theft, lies, death, sexual assault, murder, and genocide is the steps towards healing, towards recovery, and alignment. To have leaders that represent us all, to have a sense of connection, belonging, and celebration is the steps towards growth and truly embodying diversity, equity, and inclusion. The hope is here before you. It's me, a multiracial, plus-size, queer woman standing before you all sharing this message. And it's here before me, a room of mostly, not all, white, cisgender, heterosexual, privileged adults asking for and hearing this message. And it's all the space in between. It's the space of how our values connect us, of our work for justice, of growth and inclusion. In the end, we will always have countlessly more in common than we do different. Inclusion and celebration does not look like personifying stereotypes. It is not offensive sports teams' names. It is not thoughtless costumes that are actually imitating cultural regalia. And it is not people who have no seat at a table deciding what everyone eats. We must include each community, each culture, each group that has ever been minoritized, a piece of representation, a seat at the table. Whether it be the Disney producer's table, political tables, or even the table at your own home. And we must too know when the tables we sit at need the screws removed, the wood torn apart, and to sit in the warmth of the fire we start from the pieces, and from the ashes birth a new place for gathering, a table quite like no one's ever seen before, possibly not even a table at all. We all have more goodness, more wonder, more love than evil, fear, and hate. But it is the denial of the existence of both sides, of both wolves within us, of the light and dark, where we get stuck. So step into the gray with me. Step outside of the law and step into a future that we all know is capable of existing. If not, why would we all be here fighting so hard for it? In the name of all that is holy, amen.